Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. Former Halkbank executive Hakan Attila was found guilty in New York on 5 charges related to bank fraud and violating U.S. sanctions on Iran.
State-owned Halkbank's deputy chief executive, Hakan Attila, was found guilty on Wednesday by a New York jury on 5 charges related to bank fraud and conspiracy. Attila was acquitted of money laundering, another charge he faced in the case. The jury's verdict was reached after nearly a month of testimony and 4 days of deliberation. The guilty counts include violating U.S. sanctions against Iran, crimes to deceive the U.S., and defrauding U.S. banks. Following the verdict, Kathy Fleming, one of Attila's lawyers, told reporters that she was disappointed that the jury believed in Reza Zarrab and did not see the picture. Zarrab, the Iranian-Turkish businessman who became a star witness in the case, was arrested in the U.S. last year on similar charges and pleaded guilty shortly before the trial. Victor Rocco, another defense lawyer, said his client was a victim of some bizarre game. He is caught up in the middle of something. This was Reza's show. It has nothing to do with Attila. He is innocent and he intends to continue to fight, Rocco told reporters outside the courthouse. Meanwhile, Judge Richard Berman is expected to sentence Attila on April 11th, but the defense lawyers have said that they would immediately appeal the verdict after sentencing. Hakan Attila was arrested after visiting the U.S. last March on a business trip. Zarrab, on the other hand, was arrested in 2016 when he flew to Florida to take his Turkish pop star wife Ebru Gündeş and daughter to Disney World.
Joining us from Washington, D.C. tonight to talk about the current protests in Iran and their implications for Turkey and the regional Kurdish question is our monitor and Diken columnist Amberin Zaman. Good evening, Ms. Zaman. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. Good evening. Thank you. So let's start by trying to make sense of what's going on in Iran currently, at the moment. Did these protests come as a surprise to you? And how are they coming along? Are they dying out, or can we talk about a severe threat against the Iranian regime?
Well, I think it came as a surprise to everybody, and not least to the Iranians themselves. And they're the first to acknowledge this, in particular the members of the Green Movement. As you recall, in 2009, you had those massive protests in the wake of the election, which many regarded as having been fraudulent when Ahmadinejad had won. And there ensued massive protests and a very, very severe crackdown, leading to the deaths of over 100 people. But that was a movement that was a very urban, sort of middle-class, stroke intellectual, liberal kind of movement. This is a very different sort of animal, as it were, and they began in Mashhad, as you know, and driven largely by the rural poor and disaffected, unemployed millennials, and people who feel deeply frustrated that economic conditions have not improved in the Islamic Republic. It seems, though, that over the past 2 days, as the government begins to crack down more severely, people are sort of hunkering down, and there is this sort of sense that the protests are beginning to fizzle out. But that's not to say that it does not constitute this eruption of frustration, does not constitute a deep threat to the regime, because indeed many of these people who are out on the streets are people who would be regarded as the natural constituents of this regime. So I think for as long as the government does not address the grievances that led to this sort of upheaval, the potential for these sorts of protests to erupt anew remains very real.
Ms. Zaman, let's come to Turkey-Iran relations for a bit now. So the relationship between Turkey and Iran was previously pretty tense, actually, due to the two countries' positions in Syria. But the Astana talks and the recent summit in Sochi initiated some sort of a rapprochement between Turkey and Iran. And this was actually further consolidated by the joint stance maintained by Ankara and Tehran during the Iraqi Kurdish referendum. So do you think these protests in Iran have a potential to influence the current state of Turkey-Iran relations?
Well, first of all, you know, Turkish-Iranian relations have always been very complicated and compartmentalized. On the one hand, they are regional rivals, have been throughout history. But on the other hand, there are so many issues that unite the two countries and their neighbors, and obviously have to deal with each other. They're very strong economic ties, relying quite a bit on Iranian natural gas. Among other things, Iran provides a land route to Central Asia for Turkey. But as you mentioned, more recently, of course, the convergence has been over Syria and Iraq, basically because both countries share this deep fear of Kurdish separatism. And I think that's what brings the two countries together. And while on the one hand, they haven't hesitated to use respect for Kurdish groups to destabilize each other, you know, when push comes to shove, that nationalism appears to threaten them both and simultaneously, I think they set aside all of that and they cooperate. And we're seeing that happen currently in Iraq, as you said, and certainly during this whole process of the Iraqi Kurdistan independence referendum, and also in Syria, where the YPG, the group that has close links to the PKK, has been growing in influence and doing so with the support of the United States. And of course, Turkey has experienced unrest itself, this government, particularly in 2013 when you had the Gezi movement. Of course, that was, in sociological terms, a very different kind of dynamic, again, much more urban, middle class, and driven by a different set of grievances. But all the same, I think both countries, both governments, rather, should I say, have this persistent sense of being under siege from hostile foreign powers that are determined to overthrow them. And I think that was certainly sharpened, that sense of outside interference of Western powers, Israel, others that the government in Turkey deems to be hostile, seeking to overthrow it in the most recent coup attempt last year. And the government hasn't been shy about airing its view that foreign powers, the West, the United States, and others were involved. And similarly, Iran, the Iranian regime, has been saying that the West and, you know, foreign powers, Israel, others, have been instrumental in mobilizing people to help destabilize the regime.
And taking all of these into consideration, how crucial is the sustainability of the Iranian regime for Turkey at the moment?
Well, it's not so much the regime itself. I mean, in terms of, you know, its ideology, etc., being, you know, the fact that it should remain in power is not because Turkey believes that it's a great regime, but it's much more to do with stability. Already, you have Syria that's come unstuck, and there are no signs that stability or peace will come to that country anytime soon. And then you have all the instability in Iraq that erupted over the past few months with the referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan and the central government's reaction to all of that. And the potential for conflict between the Iraqi Kurds and the central government remains. And of course, that would be hugely destabilizing for Turkey, if only because you would then probably see an influx of refugees to Turkey. At the same time, we've seen over the past months how these tensions between the central government in Iraq and between the Kurds has created more space, political space, for the PKK to expand its influence. We've seen that on its border with Syria in Sinjar, for instance. And so if in turn Iran were to implode, I think, you know, it would be a complete nightmare for Turkey, considering what might then ensue. And as I mentioned earlier on, there are these important economic relations, and of course the fear of spillover and of the sort of upheaval then spreading to Turkey.
Before we wrap up, let's talk about the Kurds, actually, briefly. There are reports of protests going on at the moment in Kurdish provinces like Kermanshah, as well as in other parts of the country. So are Iran's Kurds really a player in these protests? And if so, should Turkey be worried about this?
Well, of course, throughout history, the Kurds have always, been quite restive in Iran, and particularly in the wake of the revolution when there was that authority vacuum in the Kurdish areas. There was a huge uprising, and the Kurdish groups there had seized control of much of Iranian Kurdistan, but of course the government, once it had consolidated, the new Islamic regime had consolidated power, it very quickly turned on them and suppressed them. But that's not to say that the potential for rebellion doesn't still exist. It does. But the Iranian regime has certainly been far more effective in quelling nipping that in the bud than, say, Turkey has, for instance, or Iraq has. And most of the significant Kurdish opposition groups remain in exile, are very weak, and depend very much on the sort of on the benevolence of their host country. In this case, it's the Iraqi Kurdistan regional government, which provides sanctuary for them. And is very loath, I think, to sort of allow them to be too active in Iran for fear that this would incur the wrath of Iran against them, against the Iraqi Kurds. And the Iranians have never been shy about, striking when they felt it was necessary inside Iraq, in fact, bombing Iranian Kurdish camps along that border with Iran, which is why, in part, the Iraqi Kurds forced the Iranian Kurds to move back inside Iraqi Kurdistan. But recently we see some renewed rebel activity inside Iranian Kurdistan, and we're hearing that quite a bit of that has been instigated by Saudi Arabia, that's been offering financial help and so on to the Iranian Kurds in exchange for them to sort of renew their activity against the regime. But of course that's a risky proposition for the Iranian Kurds, because it's terribly unclear to me what sort of real leverage the Saudis have in that part of the country and what their real agenda is. And then, of course, there's a PKK-linked Kurdish group, Ocak, which was also active for some time in early 2000 after the U.S. occupation of Iraq. They felt they saw an opportunity to ignite some kind of rebellion inside Iranian Kurdistan, thinking they might have the assistance of the United States in that, but very quickly realized that while there was some initial U.S. interest, it wasn't sustained, and so they sort of turned that whole thing off in 2011 and basically declared a unilateral ceasefire and haven't really been doing very much since. Of course, all these Kurdish groups are watching very keenly what Washington will do, whether Washington will actually act on its words, because as you know, President Trump has been making some quite hawkish noises, encouraging protesters, but whether that will translate into any real U.S. intervention, of course, is a very big question mark. And short of any real U.S. commitment to backing, Kurdish activity against the regime, I think they'll be very hesitant to act, really, because they've already had the bitter experience, certainly in 1991, of President Bush Sr. encouraging them to rebel against Saddam Hussein, which they did, only to have the United States sit on its hands when Saddam began to attack them very viciously, killing them by the hundreds, by the thousands, and then prompting this huge exodus of Kurds towards the Iranian and Turkish borders. But finally, before we wrap up, as you say, so the whole Syria dimension to this, and as you know, Iran is very active in Syria and very supportive of the regime, and Turkey and Iran see a convergence of interest that the Kurds do not consolidate their current influence with the backing of the United States. And so we've heard all the Kurdish groups speak up in favor of the protesters, including the PKK, which has links with the YPG, obviously, in Syria. We can read that as sort of a message to the Iranian regime that, if you keep pushing us so hard inside Syria, we may decide to sort of get nasty with you again in Iran.
Thank you very much, Ms. Zaman, for your comments and for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
We'll continue with an overview of Turkish-Iranian relations.
The two non-Arab nations of the Middle East, Turkey and Iran, have never had a straightforward alliance, cooperation, or rivalry. Over the years, the relationship between the two former imperial nations has experienced many ups and downs, yet successfully managing to avoid an armed conflict since 1823. The 2003 American invasion of Iraq stands out as a key moment in the relationship between Iran and Turkey. Despite its initial opposition to the invasion, Ankara stood closer to Washington. Aiming to prevent any escalation in the US-Iranian conflict, Turkey also positioned itself as a possible mediator between Iran and the United States. The most famous Turkish attempt to bridge the US-Iranian gap came in May 2010, when Turkey and Brazil persuaded the Iranian administration to sign a declaration agreeing to limit its nuclear program. While Turkey and Iran continued to compete in the region, the two countries were able to extend their growing energy and commercial relations due to the international sanctions on Iran that cut it off from many other markets. However, the Arab uprisings ended the period of harmony. Turkey and Iran's divergent policy choices in Syria became deal breakers for the two rival regional powers. Iran saw the rebellion against President Assad as a critical threat. During the period, Turkey worked through proxies but refrained from directly embroiling itself militarily, while Iran employed more direct proxies, such as Hezbollah, and later deployed its own forces to prevent the fall of Damascus. Recently, the diplomatic traffic between Ankara and Tehran had re-intensified. Parallel to Turkey's relationship with Russia and its stance in Syria, the Turkey-Iran relations took a positive turn with the Astana negotiation process. This shift may be seen in line with the convergence of concerns and threat perceptions in the Middle East. The two countries took a common position towards the Iraqi Kurdistan referendum process in 2017. Similarly, both countries are concerned about the overall aims of the US-Syria policy. The prospect of Kurdish autonomy in Syria and the potential spillover effect these could have on Turkey and Iran creates tension in both capitals.
Former President Abdullah Gül criticized last week's controversial emergency decree on his official Twitter account.
The criticism voiced by Turkey's former president and AKP co-founder Abdullah Gül over last week's highly disputed emergency decree has brought about various reactions from politicians. The decree grants impunity to citizens who acted to suppress the July 2016 coup attempt, extending the immunity previously granted to officials to civilians. Abdullah Gül, a longtime political ally of President Erdogan until the end of his term in office, was among the first to react to the decree. The ambiguity that does not comply with the legal phrasing of the decree law numbered 696 is worrisome in regards of the rule of law. I hope it will be revised to avoid developments that could sadden all of us in the future, Gül tweeted on December 25th. In response to Gül's tweets, President Erdogan said, "It is saddening that our former president has unfortunately mentioned ambiguity. On what grounds are you talking about ambiguity? Which article are you referring to? This is saddening." Gül responded to critiques from within the AKP by saying, "I am a president who has spent his entire life serving the government and society. Of course, it is my duty to share my vision and ideas about important matters. I believe it is nonsense to seek ulterior motives here." During the provincial convention of his party in Kastamonu, President Erdogan harshened his tone on Gül. "Shame on you. Weren't we sharing the cause?" Erdogan said. "How did you get on Kemal's boat?" he added, referring to main opposition Republican People's Party chair Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Unlike President Erdogan and AKP officials, Opposition figures have welcomed Gül's statements. Former President Gül pointed out the danger as a responsible statesman, said CHP spokesperson Bülent Tezcan. Likewise, HDP MP Garo Paylan said, "This is an era where we need to work with all who can help find a way out." As an experienced politician, Abdullah Gül too should take responsibility. Following the harsh criticism from the AKP and President Erdogan, Gül stated he became a target due to his comments on the decree. "I would like to draw attention to the increasing number of unethical and disrespectful attacks I have been subjected to by certain members of parliament and some trolls since my latest comments on the decree," he said. Gül added he would continue expressing his views and said, "As someone who believes in freedom of thought and expression, which are founding principles of our party, I will continue to express my views in situations I find necessary."
Turkey's total inward foreign direct investment amounted to $8 billion in 2017.
In response to parliamentary questions submitted by Republican People's Party CHP member Ömer Fatih Gürer, Economy Minister Nihat Zeybekçi announced on Wednesday that total foreign direct investment to Turkey amounted to $8.29 billion in 2017. Zeybekçi further stated that total inward FDI showed a 16.9% decrease in comparison with last year. Quoting the Central Bank of Turkey's balance of payment statistics, Zeybekçi also outlined the sectoral breakdown of inward FDI with the finance and insurance sector amounting to $1.42 billion, electricity and gas distribution to $927 million, logistics and storage to $770 million, and the information and communications sector to $545 million. Three sectors were followed by wholesale and retail with $398 million, rubber and plastic goods manufacturing with $245, and electronic device production with $170 million. Meanwhile, according to data published by the Turkish Statistical Institute on Wednesday, consumer headline inflation rate was at 11.92%, regressing from its 14-year peak at 12.98% in November, mainly due to price increases in the food and transportation sectors. Consumer prices saw a monthly change of 0.69% in December, surpassing forecasts. The highest annual increase was 18.24% in transportation in December, followed by food and non-alcoholic beverages with 13.79% and miscellaneous goods and services with 12.77%, according to the data published by the Turkish Statistical Institute.
Our friend Sinan Akgünay did an exclusive interview today with former Iranian diplomat and the Green Wave Movement's General Secretary, Mehrdad Konsari.
I think that the supporters of the Green Wave or Green Movement were amongst the crowds, but they did not use the slogans which they had used. So the banner of the Green Movement was not mentioned or shown or displayed in any of these protests. So whilst they are part of the public and they, participated with the general public, but it did not have any connotation that these demonstrations were in any way related to the Green Movement.
Now let's take a look at what's on in Istanbul next week.
Organized by Band Magazine, Kendine Has Demonation Festival No. 8 kicks off tonight, celebrating independent music for 3 days in 4 different venues with 11 acts. The festival will be occupying venues in both European and Asian coasts of Istanbul, with tunes ranging from hip-hop to synth-pop, from ambient to psych rock. The opening night is taking place in Kadıköy's Arko'da, with Bad Mixtape, Pulas, and Kisammen's performances. The festival will be moving to Babylon tomorrow with 5 different acts, sharing the stage. Ankara-based bands Al York and Agabando alike places, synth pop duo Kim Kyo, and Fluktuosa will be on the stage. On Sunday, Demonation Festival will return to Kadıköy with a very special performance by Group Ses, presenting his project Awesome Tapes from Turkey at Band Magazine Havuz. The final performances of the festival will be at the Kargart, staged by psychedelically brewed Congolus and synthpop act Afet Robot. The pioneering ceramic artist Freya is being recognized with the Freya Coral Retrospective Exhibition at Trevler 16, the maze-like art space in Istanbul's chic Beşiktaş district. Sponsored by Kale Industries, this largest ever show on her life and work consists of 200 pieces of art, documents, and photographs, and marks the 20th year of the artist's death and the 60th anniversary of Kale, the owner of Çanakkale Ceramics, a Turkish tile and ceramics company. Creators Karoli Aliotti, Nilüfer Şaşmazer, and Farah Aksoy emphasize that the exhibition focuses more on Freya's art than her stormy life. Freya's multicultural life and her artistic family inspired her style, combining Turkish Moors with Western art, as in her ability to take traditional hues of Turkish ceramics and reinterpret them in designs vaguely recalling Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.